William Blake is one of the giants of English literature. Nowadays, he is recognized as one of the greatest English poets, along with Shakespeare and Milton. But in his lifetime, he was totally misunderstood because his writings were very difficult to interpret. People often thought of him as being mad, literally mad. I will tell you why. And only in the middle of the 20th century, as I told you, one scholar, Northrop Frye, published a book in which he was able to reconstruct Blake's philosophy and Blake's mythology, so that now we can understand what's going on in his poems. The reading that you have comes from his unfinished poem, Four Zoas, and this poem is about the apocalypse, and the last chapter of this poem that you have as a reading is the actual apocalypse, describes the apocalypse in Blake's terms. But in order to understand his apocalypse and his stand on the book of Revelation, we have to talk about his philosophy. Now, first, let me tell you a little bit about his life. Blake was born and lived in England, and from his very early childhood was a very religious boy. He would later say that the Bible was the greatest influence on him, but not only was he reading the Bible, but he had some personal religious experience. He would say to his wife and to his friends that as a boy he saw angels. Once he saw the head of God in his window. How about that? He was personally convinced that the archangels guided him in his writing of the poems, and that they actually read his poems and were enjoying them. So in other words, Blake's religion was very unorthodox, based not only on education but on personal experiences. And many friends of Blake thought that he is crazy or mad. A famous English poet, William Wordsworth, wrote, I quote, "There was no doubt that this poor man was mad, but there is something in his madness which interests me more than the sanity of Lord Byron and Walter Scott." So he was seen by his friends as an eccentric, as a person with some strange behavior and attitude. But everyone realized that he was extremely gifted. He was a poet, a painter, and printmaker, a publisher, and he has done a lot of masterpieces, so he was extremely productive. He was married, however, the couple did not have children. He was a close friend of many radical people of the time. For example, he was a friend with early English feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, the mother of Mary Shelley. He was a friend with Thomas Paine, famous revolutionary. He was a friend with many intellectuals of his age. He was very excited about the American and the French Revolution. He was very supportive of these new developments. However, he was disappointed when the French Revolution turned into the reign of terror. So he was, as we would call him today, a progressive man. Also, in his personal views, he abhorred slavery. He believed in the equality of men and women. And he developed some unusual, unorthodox ideas about religion. Now, in his poems, he criticizes traditional religion. He criticizes Judaism because he believes that Judaism is the religion for children. He believes that Judaism is based on the idea of punishment, and punishment is usually reserved for children by their parents. But when man matures, he does not need those kind of punishments. So therefore, he thought that Judaism as a religion is basically dead, done away with. He criticizes deism. Remember, I told you that deism is the belief that God exists, but God is distant from the world, and we have only nature. So he believed that deism makes nature divine, replaces God with nature. And that was unacceptable for him because of his philosophy. He also criticizes Christianity. He was a Christian himself. He was a dissenter. At least he was born into a family of dissenters. But his Christianity was very unorthodox, and he criticizes Christianity for suppressing the life of the body. He thinks that Christianity is not the religion of joy because it rejects the joy of the body and bodily life. Now, Blake was a student at the Royal Academy of London. The conditions of his study did not require him to pay anything, but he was required to pay for everything that is needed for him to paint, brushes, etc. And when he was the student at the Academy of London, the director of the Academy was famous neoclassical theorist Joshua Reynolds. And Joshua Reynolds published a book that was called Discourses, in which he talked about neoclassical form of painting, in which he would focus on classification, rationalization, and those kind of techniques. Joshua Reynolds believed that the capacity to make classifications and rationalizations is the greatest capacity of the human mind. So Blake was reading this book, but he rebelled against this attitude from the very beginning. On the margins, in his personal copy of Discourses, he wrote, I quote, "To generalize is to be an idiot. To particularize is alone distinction of merit." So from the very beginning, Blake was a romantic, and he's usually classified as a romantic. But his romanticism is of a very special kind, and we'll talk about that when we come to his poetry. Blake died in 1827. Here is one account of his death. "He died in a most glorious manner. He said he was going to that country he had all his life wished to see, and expressed himself happy, hoping for salvation through Jesus Christ. Just before he died, his countenance became fair, his eyes brightened, and he burst out singing of the things he saw in heaven." We won't be able to understand his writing until we understand his philosophy and his mythology, because his philosophical ideas are expressed in his poems through the mythological characters, and each character personifies a certain idea. So that's why it was very difficult to understand what he's writing about. He created his own world, like Tolkien in the 20th century. But his mythology is psychological. All of his characters are ultimate expressions of our psychic abilities and psychic powers. So therefore, in order to understand it, we have to know what kind of philosophy is behind this mythology. As I told you before, in modern philosophy, there were two main schools of thought: empiricism and rationalism. So empiricists are those philosophers who believe that all knowledge comes to us through sense perception. There is nothing innate in our mind. We are not born with pre-existing knowledge. We gather everything we know from our sensory experience. Rationalists, on the other hand, believe that there is some knowledge that is pre-installed or pre-exists in our minds, some innate ideas that are developed when we come into a contact with the sensory world. Now, in his philosophy, Blake rejects both schools of thought. First, he is against empiricism. He is against empiricism because he believes that the true world, the world as it is very different from the world that we encounter through the senses. So, for example, John Locke, who is the father of empiricist philosophy, believes that the ideas come to us from real time and real space. Blake, on the other hand, believes that space and time themselves are part of our sensory perception. We see the world through our senses, and we see this world as being in space and in time, not because this is the nature of the world, but because this is the nature of our perception. So therefore, perception by itself gives us a distorted picture of the world. So the reason Blake rejects empiricist epistemology, the idea that sense perception is the main source of our knowledge, is because he believes that we are in a fallen state of mind, and our fallen condition, which is the result of the original sin, consists in our perception being distorted. The world has fallen into a fallen state, and our perception reacts to this fallen world with a fallen perception. So by perceiving something, we actually do not receive any true knowledge. We are imprisoned in our limiting perception, and that prevents us from achieving true knowledge. So this is a matrix idea before matrix. Blake rejects rationalism because he believes that science does not actually give us anything new, because science is based on the world of our perception. Science delivers certain abstractions, certain regularities that we are able to perceive in this world. But these abstractions reflect the same world of perception. So therefore, neither perception itself nor rational investigation of our world in which we live would not give us true knowledge. So what is the source of true knowledge? And here we come to the most interesting part of Blake's philosophy, because of which I believe he was called mad. Blake thinks that the most important part of our mind is imagination. Imagination is that faculty in us that is developed slowly and later than all other faculties. But it is imagination, human imagination, that can actually deliver the knowledge of the true world, of the world as it is. Blake is a literalist of human imagination. He thinks that our imagination, along with all other faculties, are in the fallen condition, and therefore our imagination is distorted. However, he believes that it is imagination, if it is open to the true wonders of the world, it is imagination that can deliver us from the prison of perception and rationality. So in other words, Blake is the literalist of imagination, and people who think that everything we imagine is true are usually called mad. But in his case, he is simply an artist, and every artist appreciates imagination. In his poems, Blake distinguishes 4 levels of imagination. Ulro, this is the bottom, the lowest level. This is Blake's hell. And for Blake, Ulro is that world in which there is pure subjectivity. only us. Here is why Blake is not our typical romantic. Typical romantics in fact, they love pure subjectivity. But Blake believes that pure subjectivity is actually wrong, that human beings have to move away from themselves to the real world. So then the next world is the world of generation. Generation is our three-dimensional world of space and time. It is the world that is objectified, in which there is the subject and the object. So we may call it purgatory. And finally, Blake's paradise is divided into two sections, Beulah and Eden. Beulah is that level of imagination which corresponds to the love between human beings. The symbol of Beulah is family, the love between husband and a wife, which gives birth to the offspring. And finally, the upper level of heaven, for which Blake reserves the name Eden, the biblical name Eden, is that level of imagination that functions on the basis of the principle of love between humanity and divinity, love between God and human beings. And this is the highest human aspiration. Okay, now that we know his basic philosophy, let's talk about his mythology, or different characters in his poem that personify certain features of our psyche. And let's come straight to Blake's Apocalypse. At the center of Blake's poems lies the idea of the Four Zoas. The poem that you were supposed to read for today, or the excerpt from the poem that you were supposed to read, is called the Four Zoas. Four Zoas, this is the key term for the Apocalypse and for Blake's art. Zoas is a Greek word that is taken from the book of Revelation and that is translated in the book of Revelation as the creatures or the beasts. Now remember the white throne judgment. The guy sitting on the white throne. There are 24 elders in standard Christian interpretation, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles of Jesus. And there are 4 creatures with the face of man, lion, eagle, and ox. Remember last time we talked about apocalyptic art, I told you that these creatures in Christian interpretation usually mean 4 evangelists, 4 authors of the Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. But the origin of those creatures is much older. This creature, this mythological creature with the face of a man, with the head of a lion, with the wings of the eagle, and with the body of an ox, is already present in ancient Assyrian culture. From Assyrian culture, it made its way into Hebrew scriptures, into the book of Ezekiel. From the book of Ezekiel, it made its way into the book of Revelation. And in the book of Revelation, these are already 4 different creatures, and they are the good creatures, good beasts, who worship at the throne of the Creator. Now, as I told you, the standard interpretation is that it is either the authors of the Gospel or some kind of empires that follow the lead of the judge. But Blake comes up with a totally different reinterpretation of the 4 Zoas. For Blake, the 4 Zoas mean the 4 aspects of man, meaning the 4 aspects of a human being. 4 different aspects of a human being. The first one is tharmas, which is our body. The second one, uraizan, easy to remember, like Verizon. So horizon, which is our reason. The third one is luva, or our emotions. And finally, urthona, or our imagination. Now, Blake creates those strange words, strange sounding words. And sometimes we have some idea where they come from, sometimes we don't. But this is the way he creates his own mythology. So according to Blake's idea, the fall of man represents the beginning of disharmony between those four aspects of man. In the very beginning of creation, man was created in the image and likeness of God. Now here Blake is also an Orthodox Christian. He believes that God is not triune. It is not the Trinity of God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but there was one fourth element in God. And this is the element that started the rebellion and would become what we know as the devil or the Satan. This initial rebellion would be expressed in human being as being fallen into the condition of chaos and disharmony. Originally, those four zoas, those four aspects of man, were in harmony with each other, without anyone superseding others or being more powerful than others. But as a result of the fall, those four aspects of man are starting to usurp the power for themselves. Horizon believes that he is God, and he descends into the lower levels of existence and becomes, and here I'm just telling you the plot of one of Blake's poems. So Horizon descends into the lower depths of existence and becomes the God of the Old Testament. In Blake's poems, it is Horizon, or reason, who has distorted his abilities, is trying to assert his power. He presents himself as the God of the Old Testament, and it is Horizon who actually establishes Judaism, the religion of punishment. It is Horizon who creates our world in 7 days, our distorted world. It is Horizon who establishes the first empires, and it is Horizon who establishes slavery as part of this imperial world. In other words, Horizon does everything that Blake hates. Every human zoa, every aspect of a human being, according to Blake, in his poems, has various emanations. The emanations of those zoas usually take on their own separate existence in the lower levels of this world. So Orc is an emanation of Luva. Orc is an emanation of emotions. Orc symbolizes, personifies revolution. And Orc is born from emotions because revolutions are never rational, very emotional. And also because suppressed love usually turns into violence. So when Blake describes Orc in his poems, and he has a series of poems about American and French revolutions, in which he basically creates a pattern, outlines a pattern of every revolution. Every revolution begins with emotional outbursts, with violence, then goes through success, initial success, then goes through some kind of reaction, and then ends in the final failure. So when Blake talks about Orc, he describes this character who is full of anger and rage and wants revenge. In Blake's poems, Orc is actually born out of the union of Los and Enitharmon. I will tell you about Los later. Los is the emanation of Urthona, of imagination, and Los is the artist. So Los and Enitharmon give birth to Orc, and Orc is jealous of his father, is attracted to his mother. Here Blake kind of anticipates Freud and Freud's idea of Oedipal concept. And as a result, he is able to revolt. He is able to make alliance with the Horizon. And he produces what we in the world experience as revolutions. Now, imagine that for Blake, our world is just one of the levels of existence. And our level of existence is encompassed by different other layers of existence. And whatever we experience here is actually a result of some kind of activity in higher levels of the world. So who is Los? A couple of words about this guy. Los is an artist. He is the emanation of Urthona, human imagination. According to Blake, imagination is the most important faculty in human being. And the result of imagination is art. As Blake writes in one of his poems, if the doors of human imagination were open, then we would have seen the world as it really is, infinite and blissful. But since the doors of our perception are closed, then we see the world in space and time. We see the world full of suffering and evil. So Los represents creative imagination. He is the poet. And most importantly for Blake, it is Los who creates Galganuza. He creates Jerusalem. He creates Erin. And these are three most important beliefs that refer to the apocalypse. So what is Galganuza? Galganuza, in Blake's poems, is the city of art. So imagine Los stands in London on the banks of the Thames, building Galganuza, which covers the whole of Britain. As I told you, for Blake, this world is not the whole thing. It is just one of the worlds that exists. And there are many other levels, spiritual levels. So Los exists on this spiritual level. He builds Galganuza, which is the city of art, and which covers the whole of Britain. And from it extends the spiritual fourfold London in the creative loins of Albion. What is Jerusalem? As you remember, Jerusalem is one of the symbols in Revelation. And in Revelation, it means peace, new religion, the revival of religion. It can mean the real state of Israel, political state of Israel. In Blake's poems, Jerusalem means the idea of freedom, liberty. Blake thinks that without the idea of liberty, humanity will not be able to attain true salvation. Now, in a way, Blake is right, because it was England who offered us the idea of liberty for the first time in the Great Charter in the 13th century. England gave us liberty, the idea of liberty. America gave us the idea of equality. So Jerusalem is liberty, and Erin is the sense of holiness of everything in the world. As I told you, Blake blamed Christianity for suppressing the life of the body and the joy of the life of the body. Blake believed that everything is holy in this world, including bodily love. So Erin is the idea of holiness or sacredness of everything that exists in the world. How does Blake describe the Last Judgment? And here we come to the last topic. So those 20 pages that you were asked to read for today and that you haven't read, and maybe this is good. Now, after our discussion, you can read them. So those 20 pages, this last chapter of Blake's poem, Four Zoas, describes the apocalypse according to Blake, the Last Judgment. Since for Blake, the fall of man involves the disharmony of our four main aspects: body, emotions, reason, and imagination, the Last Judgment and the Apocalypse mean the restoration of those four aspects of man. Those four aspects, our physical body, our imagination, our reason, and our emotions, find their way back to the original state of harmony. And here is how Blake describes this in the last chapter of his poem Four Zoas. The trumpets, waking the dead, sound immediately after the moment of death. In the general resurrection, all the oppressed wreak their vengeance on the oppressors for all unexpiated injustices and cruelties. Albion wakes. He blames Horizon, who, on renouncing all idea of dominion, instantly regains his pristine youth. So Horizon, as you remember, is the principle of reason, and Blake, as a true romantic, blames reason, Horizon, on everything evil that is happening in the world. So Horizon renounces the idea of dominion and instantly regains his original condition. The Son of Man descends from Jerusalem and sits upon his throne, but there is work to be done before Albion can enter into consummation. This work takes 6 days to reverse and undo the 6 days of creation. It consists of the great harvest and vintage for making the bread and wine of eternity, reminding us of the Christian Eucharist as the main Christian ritual of salvation. On the earth, however, these rural activities are the disasters described in Revelation. Eventually, the Zoas find their emanations. Loss becomes Urthona again. Urthona is imagination. And the epic ends with the sunrise of the seventh day, the Sabbath of the millennium. So the millennium comes as a result of the ultimate restoration of the human condition. To sum up, Blake's reinterpretation of Revelation is purely artistic and very psychological. He thinks of apocalypse and judgment happening in the world, but mostly in human mind. For him, the salvation means the restoration of psychological harmony and stability. So Blake's apocalypse is very subjective, very romantic, and kind of crazy.